The lawyer slid the folder across the table toward me, and I remember thinking, why does he look like that? Why does a man who does this for a living, a man who has probably seen everything, look like he's watching a building burn down? I opened the folder, and there it was. Page after page after page, my mother's will, her bank accounts, the property deed to the house I grew up in, the investment portfolio my father spent 30 years building before he died. Every single document, and on every single one, my name was gone. Not crossed out, not amended, not updated. Replaced. Like I had never existed. Like I was never her daughter. Like 34 years of my life had been quietly, carefully, surgically removed, and my sister's name had been sewn into the wound. I looked up at the lawyer. He was still watching me with that expression. That look that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite shock. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was sitting across from someone whose entire family had lied to their face. He cleared his throat. He said, "Miss Calloway, I think we need to talk." And that was the moment I understood that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. Let me take you back to the beginning, because trust me, you need to understand where this started to truly understand how far it went. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe to Betrayal Ledger for more. Hi, my name is Claire Calloway. I'm 34 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon, though for most of my life I lived in a small town in rural Ohio called Millhaven, population about 8,000 people, where everyone knew your name and your business and your mother's opinion of you. Before all of this happened, I would have described my life as complicated, but okay. I was a middle school art teacher. I loved my job. I loved my kids. My students, I mean. I had a small apartment I'd made into something cozy. I had a cat named Fig. I had a decent group of friends, a gym membership I used maybe twice a month, and a relationship with my family that I thought was just normal. Not perfect, not warm exactly, but normal. I was the kind of woman who called her mother every Sunday, who sent birthday cards, actual physical cards with stamps, to every member of my family, who drove 4 hours home for Thanksgiving even when she didn't really want to, who convinced herself that a little emotional distance, a little favoritism, a lot of favoritism, was just how some families worked. I told myself that for 34 years. I was wrong. And the person who finally made me see it was a 63-year-old estate lawyer named Gerald Whitmore, who slid a folder across his desk with shaking hands and changed the entire story of my life. But I need to start from the beginning. I need to tell you about my sister first. Her name is Diane. She's 3 years younger than me, 31. And look, I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling this story to make you hate my sister. What happened isn't entirely her fault. She was shaped by the same hands that shaped me. She was raised by the same woman. She just turned out differently. Diane is the kind of person who walks into a room and everyone looks up. She's beautiful, genuinely, almost aggressively beautiful, with this warm laugh and this way of making you feel like you're the most important person in the world when she's talking to you. She was prom queen. She married young, a guy named Marcus who makes a lot of money doing something in finance that I never fully understood. They live in a big house in Columbus with a pool and 2 golden retrievers. My mother adored her. No, that's not strong enough. My mother lived for her, breathed for her, restructured her entire personality around Diane's happiness and Diane's approval and Diane's next achievement. I noticed it early. Really early. Like 6 or 7 years old early. The way Mom's voice changed when she talked about Diane. Softer, prouder, like she was describing a piece of art she'd made. When she talked about me, there was always this slight flatness. Not cruelty, just flatness. Like she was reporting facts. Claire got a B on her math test. Diane won the spelling bee. Isn't that something? I told myself it was just personality. Mom and Diane were similar. Social, charming, a little performative. Mom and I were not. I was quiet. I liked books and drawing. I didn't need the spotlight the way Diane did. So naturally, I reasoned, Mom connected with the daughter who was more like her. That's normal, right? Parents connect differently with different kids. I told myself that for 25 years. My dad, his name was Robert, Dad to me, Bob to everyone else. He was different. He was quiet like me. He loved history and woodworking and bad puns. He used to say, "Claire Bear, you've got a whole universe in your head. Don't let anybody tell you that's not the most valuable thing in the world." He died when I was 26. Heart attack, sudden, gone in an afternoon. And when he died, something shifted in my family that I didn't fully understand until much, much later. After Dad passed, Mom leaned into Diane even harder, which I understood. Grief does strange things to people. But what I didn't notice, because I was grieving too, and because I was 4 hours away building my own life, was what was happening behind the scenes. I didn't notice it, but it was happening. The first crack I remember, the first thing that made me uneasy, even if I couldn't name why, happened about 2 years after my dad died. I came home for Christmas. This would have been when I was 28, and Mom mentioned, casually, over dinner, that she'd had her will updated. "Just sorting things out," she said, spooning more potatoes onto Diane's plate. "Your father would have wanted everything organized." I said, "Oh, that's good, Mom. Smart to have it sorted." And she smiled. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. I thought nothing of it. Then, about 6 months later, I was home for Mom's birthday. She'd turned 60, and I was helping her clean out some files in the den, just organizing. And I came across a document from her bank, an account I didn't recognize. "Mom, what's this account?" I asked. She came over, looked at it, and took it out of my hand so quickly it was almost like a reflex. "Oh, that's just a savings account, nothing interesting." And she put it in a drawer and closed it. I remember standing there for a second thinking, that was weird. But I let it go. Because she was my mom. Because I trusted her. Because who suspects their own mother? And that's when things started getting strange in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I'll get to that in a moment, because first I need to tell you about the phone call that made me realize I might not know my family as well as I thought. It was a Tuesday evening, maybe a year after the birthday visit. I was sitting at my kitchen table grading papers when my phone rang. It was my Aunt Patricia, my dad's sister, the one my mom had always kept at a slight distance, the one who used to send me birthday money in envelopes with little notes that said your dad would be proud of you. I loved Aunt Patricia. We didn't talk often, but when we did, it felt like being wrapped in something warm. She asked how I was. We chatted for a few minutes, and then she got quiet, and she said, "Claire, honey, I need to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't upset you." I said, "Of course, what is it?" She said, "When your father died, did your mother share his estate documentation with you? Did you see the original will he had?" I said, I know Dad left everything to Mom, which is standard. Why?" Silence. "Patricia, why are you asking?" She said, "I'm probably overreacting. It's just, your father called me the week before he died. We talked for a long time. He mentioned he'd recently updated his will to make sure, his exact words, Claire, to make sure both his girls were taken care of." I felt something shift in my chest, something cold. "What do you mean?" "He told me he'd set aside a portion specifically for you. Not large, but meaningful. A college fund account he'd never touched, plus some of his woodworking tools and his grandfather's watch collection. He was very specific about it." I sat very still. "Patricia, I never received any of that." Another silence. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm calling. Now here's where I want to pause, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Claire, you should have confronted your mom right then. You should have demanded answers. But let me explain why I didn't. Because what Aunt Patricia said next made my blood run cold, and honestly, it made me feel like I was the crazy one. Patricia said she could be wrong. She said maybe she'd misunderstood Dad's call. She said she didn't want to cause family drama over a memory. She said maybe those things had been sent to me and I'd forgotten. She was 80% sure but not 100. And that 20%. That small possibility that she was misremembering a conversation with a grieving man's sister, was enough for me to second-guess myself. I am not proud of this. I didn't call my mom. I didn't ask questions. I went back to my papers, and I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding, and I added it to the drawer in my mind where I kept all the things I'd decided not to look at too closely. But the drawer was filling up. Then my sister called me out of the blue on a random Wednesday night, which was unusual, because Diane and I talked maybe once a month at most. She was bright and chatty and asked about work, and then she said, "Oh hey, I meant to tell you. Marcus and I are helping Mom with some financial stuff. Just organizing her accounts and making sure everything's set up right. You know how she is? She gets overwhelmed." I said, "Oh, okay, is she all right?" "She's fine. Totally fine. We just want to make sure everything's in order." "Should I be involved?" I asked. "I'm happy to help." A very brief pause, so brief I almost missed it. "Oh, don't worry about it," Diane said. "We've got it handled. You're so busy with school." I was the school. I was the one 4 hours away. And that tiny, almost imperceptible pause, lodged itself in the back of my throat like a splinter. But I swallowed it, like I always did. What broke everything open wasn't some dramatic confrontation. It wasn't me deciding to be brave or set boundaries or demand truth. It was a stranger's mistake. 6 months ago, I got a letter in the mail. It was addressed to me, Claire Calloway, and it was from a law firm in Columbus called Whitmore and Associates. The letter was brief and professional. It said that Gerald Whitmore, Esquires, had been retained to handle the estate planning of my mother, Beverly Calloway, and that as a named beneficiary in a previous document on file, I was being notified of a recent amendment. I read that sentence 3 times. As a named beneficiary in a previous document, that meant there was a previous document. That meant at some point I had been named. And now there was an amendment. I called the firm the next morning. The receptionist was polite. She said Mr. Whitmore could speak with me, but given the nature of the matter, he'd prefer to do so in person. I asked if I could just have a quick answer to one question. Was my name still in my mother's will? She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said, "Mr. Whitmore can see you Thursday." That was my answer. I drove 4 hours to Columbus on a Thursday morning in February. The Whitmore and Associates office was in a beige building downtown, warm inside with soft carpet and a fish tank in the waiting room. I sat there for 15 minutes watching fish and feeling like I was underwater myself. Gerald Whitmore was a small man with silver hair and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck. He shook my hand, he offered me coffee, and then he sat down across from me and he just looked at me for a moment, like he was figuring out how to do something difficult. "Miss Calloway," he said, "thank you for coming in." "Of course," I said. "Can you tell me what's going on?" He opened a folder, a thick one. "I have to be transparent with you," he said, "because frankly, receiving your call this week clarified something that had been bothering me for some time." He slid the folder across the table. I opened it, and I described this moment at the beginning of my video because I need you to understand. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw, page after page after page. Every legal document associated with my mother's estate. The will, the property deed, the investment accounts, the joint savings account she'd been building since my father died, the one she'd taken out of my hands all those years ago. Every document, and on every single one, where my name should have been, where Claire Calloway should have appeared, it said, Diane Calloway Harris. I turned the pages slowly, and slowly and slowly. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that Gerald Whitmore refilled my water glass and waited. Finally I said, "She took my name off everything." He said, "Over a period of approximately 6 years, yes. The amendments were staggered. Small changes at first, the will, then the property deed. The investment accounts were the most recent." 6 years, 6 years. She had spent 6 years quietly, systematically removing me. And all the while I had been calling every Sunday, sending birthday cards with stamps, driving 4 hours for Thanksgiving. "She took my father's estate too," I said. It wasn't a question. I already knew. He cleared his throat. "I'm not able to speak to documents outside my firm's involvement, but the previous will I have on file, your mother's from 8 years ago, does list you as an equal beneficiary alongside your sister. 8 years ago, before Dad died, she had waited until he was gone. And then the worst thought hit me. The one that made me feel sick to my stomach. The one I hadn't let myself fully form until that moment in that beige office with the fish tank in the waiting room. Diane knew. She had to know. She and Marcus had been helping Mom with the finances. She had called me that Wednesday to tell me not to get involved. She had paused, that half-second pause, when I asked if I should help. She knew. I said very quietly, "Did my sister know?" Gerald Whitmore looked at me over his glasses, and he said, with the careful precision of a man who has chosen every word, "I can only speak to what the documents show, Miss Calloway. And what they show is that the amendments to your mother's estate were initiated and witnessed under advisement that included Ms. Calloway Harris and her husband." He said it like a verdict, because it was. I walked out of that office into the February cold, and I sat in my car, and I did not cry. I think I was too far past crying. I sat there, and I thought about all the Sundays, all the cards, all the Thanksgivings, all the years I had told myself that my mother loved me the same as Diane, just differently, quietly, in her own way. She didn't love me differently. She had spent 6 years erasing me. I sat in my car for 40 minutes. And then I called Aunt Patricia. She answered on the second ring, the way she always does, and I said, "Patricia, you were right, about all of it." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Oh, sweetheart, I was afraid of that." I said, "I need to know everything Dad told you. Everything." We talked for 2 hours. My father, in that call the week before he died, had been specific. He'd left me the savings account, about $42,000, his grandfather's watch collection, and his full set of hand-built woodworking tools that he'd spent 20 years collecting. He'd told Patricia the account number. He'd told her where the watches were kept. None of it had ever reached me. When Dad died and Mom handled the estate, I had been deep in grief, 4 hours away, trusting that my mother was handling things properly. I had signed some paperwork. I barely remembered what. I had not asked questions because asking questions felt disrespectful to his memory. I let my mother handle it, and she had. After I hung up with Patricia, I sat quietly for a moment, and I made a decision. Not an angry, reactive decision, a clear one. The kind of decision that feels almost frighteningly calm because you've moved past the grief and the disbelief and arrived somewhere harder and colder and more resolute. I was not going to let this be buried. I went back into Gerald Whitmore's office the next morning, and I asked him to refer me to an estate litigation attorney. He gave me a name without hesitation. I got the impression he'd been hoping I would ask. The attorney he recommended was a woman named Sandra Okafor, and within a week I was sitting in her office, laying out everything. The documents from Whitmore, the conversation with Patricia, the timeline of amendments, all of it. Sandra listened with a legal pad in front of her, making notes, and when I finished, she said, "Okay, here's what we have and here's what we need." She explained that the staggered amendments, if they could be proven to have been made without my knowledge or consent, and in some cases, under circumstances that suggested undue influence, could form the basis of a legal challenge. Dad's estate was more complicated because time had passed and documents had been signed, but there might be grounds there too, especially with Patricia's testimony. "This isn't going to be fast," Sandra told me, "and it's going to be painful because you're going to have to sit across from your mother and your sister in a legal context." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready for that?" I thought about the 6 years, the Sunday phone calls, the birthday cards, the pauses on the phone. "Yes," I said. Before the legal process began, before letters were sent, before anything was official, I did one thing first. I drove to Millhaven. I didn't call ahead. I knocked on my mother's door on a Saturday morning and she answered in her robe, and her face when she saw me. I will never forget her face. For a single second before she composed herself, she looked caught, not surprised, not happy to see me, caught. She said, "Claire, this is unexpected." I said, "Can I come in?" We sat in the living room, the same living room I grew up in, with the same floral couch and the same watercolor print of sunflowers over the fireplace, and I put the copies of the documents on the coffee table between us, and I said, "I've been to see Gerald Whitmore." She looked at the papers. She was silent. "Mom," I said, "I need you to explain this to me. I need you to look me in the eyes and explain why my name is gone." She didn't look at the papers. She looked at her hands. And what she said, "I want you to really hear this, because it tells you everything you need to know about the story." She said, "Diane needs it more than you do. She has a family." That was it. That was her explanation. Not an apology. Not a denial, not even an attempt at justification beyond that single devastating sentence. Diane needs it more than you do. She has a family. As if I weren't her family. As if I didn't exist. I sat with that sentence for a moment. And then I stood up, and I picked up my documents, and I said, I have a lawyer. I walked out the door. I did not cry until I was in my car. And then I cried for a long time. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. I cried because I was human. Because some part of me had still, somewhere deep and stubborn and irrational, hoped for a different answer. Had hoped she would say, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I love you. Had hoped that the woman who gave birth to me had some explanation that would make this make sense. She didn't. And in a strange way, that was clarifying. Because after I stopped crying, I felt, not better, but clear, like a fever breaking. I drove back to Portland. I called Sandra on Monday, and we began. I'm not going to give you a Hollywood ending. This isn't that kind of story. Here's what happened. Sandra sent formal legal notices to my mother and to my sister regarding the estate documents. The response from my mother's lawyer, because yes, she immediately lawyered up, was that my mother had the right to distribute her estate as she saw fit, and that the amendments were entirely legal and her prerogative, which is technically true. Here's what's also true. There are laws around undue influence in estate changes, and when we began looking at the timeline, the fact that Diane and Marcus had been present for and advising every single amendment, we had a foundation for an argument that my mother had been, at minimum, heavily guided in these decisions. Sandra also sent a formal request for documentation regarding my father's estate. And this is where things got genuinely complicated. Because when we received the paperwork, we found something. A discrepancy. The savings account Patricia had described, the $42,000, there was a transfer record. Money moved from that account to a joint account in my mother's and Diane's names, approximately 3 months after my father's death. I had signed paperwork at the time, not understanding the full picture. But Sandra argued there was a case that I had not been properly informed of assets I was entitled to before signing. I won't pretend this was clean or easy or fast. It took 14 months. 14 months of legal back and forth and depositions and documents and moments where I questioned whether I had the strength to keep going. Diane called me twice during those 14 months. The first time was angry, accusing me of tearing the family apart, saying I was doing this out of spite, asking how I could do this to Mom. I let her finish, and then I said, Diane, you were in the room when they changed every document. You knew. She hung up. The second call was different. She was quieter. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't thought it was a big deal because she figured I had my own life and my own money and I didn't need it. She said Mom had convinced her I didn't care about the family legacy. She said she should have said something. I don't know how much of that I believe. I think some of it was true, and some of it was what she needed to tell herself to sleep at night. I think Diane isn't the villain of this story so much as she's someone who loved being chosen and never asked too many questions about what being chosen cost someone else. We didn't reach a full resolution in court. We reached a settlement. My mother's estate documents were amended, again, to restore me as an equal beneficiary. The argument regarding my father's savings account resulted in a settlement payment of $31,000, which wasn't the full 42, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that something had been taken. It was not nothing. My relationship with my mother is essentially over. She attended the mediation and she barely looked at me. When it was finished and the lawyers were packing up their things, she walked past me toward the door and for one moment she stopped. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment. I braced for something. An apology. An acknowledgement. She said, I hope you're satisfied. And she left. I stood there for a moment. And then I looked at Sandra, and Sandra looked at me. And I said, yeah, I think I am. Not because of the money. The money mattered. It validated that something real had been taken from me. But what I was satisfied about was simpler and deeper than that. I had looked at an impossible truth and I hadn't looked away. I had stopped telling myself that the way my family treated me was normal, or that I didn't deserve better, or that making peace meant accepting erasure. I had stopped shrinking. I moved to Portland 2 years before all of this started. Some part of me, I think, already knew I needed distance. Now I'm fully here, I've built a life I actually love. I still teach middle school art and I still love my kids. I still have Fig. He's getting old and a little grumpy, which honestly feels appropriate. I have friends who know my story and love me anyway. I have Aunt Patricia, who calls every Sunday now, and whose voice sounds a lot like my father's when she laughs. Do I miss my mother? Yes. But I miss the mother I wanted her to be. The one I spent 34 years trying to earn. That mother never existed. And you can't grieve something you never had the same way you grieve something you lost. It's a different kind of sorrow. Quieter, and eventually smaller. My sister and I are not close, but we are in contact. It's awkward and fragile and probably always will be. I think she genuinely didn't fully understand the scope of what had happened, and I think she genuinely felt some remorse. I also think she enjoyed being the favorite and didn't ask questions she didn't want answered. People are complex, family especially. The thing I come back to, the thing I want you to hear, is that I spent 30 years convincing myself that what I saw wasn't really there. That the favoritism wasn't that bad. That the flatness in my mother's voice when she talked about me was just her personality. That taking myself out of the equation, making myself smaller, not demanding things, was the way to keep the peace. All that did was give people space to take more. If something is telling you that something is wrong, that drawer in your mind that keeps filling up with things you've decided not to look at, listen to it. You don't have to go to war. You don't have to hire a lawyer and blow up your family. But listen to it. Let yourself see what's actually there. You deserve to have your name on the things that belong to you. You deserve to take up space. So that's my story. Or at least, it's the version I can tell right now, from where I'm standing, in an apartment in Portland with a cat on my lap and a cup of tea going cold on the table. I'm still processing parts of it, honestly. I think I will be for a long time. That's okay. Healing doesn't have an end date. But I wanted to share it because when I was in the middle of all of this, in those 14 months of legal back and forth, in those moments of doubt where I thought maybe I'm the problem, maybe I'm making too much of this, what helped me most was knowing I wasn't alone, that other people had experienced the weight of being deprioritized in their own families, that what I was feeling was real and it was valid and I wasn't crazy for feeling it. So, have you ever been in a situation like this? Have you ever looked at your family, or a partner, or a friend, and realized that what you thought was love was actually something more conditional? Something that came with fine print you were never shown? What did you do? Did you stay quiet? Did you speak up? Did you walk away or did you fight? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. I think the most valuable thing in the comments section of a video like this isn't people agreeing with me. It's people sharing their own truths, their own locked drawers, their own moments of clarity. You're not alone, and neither am I. Thank you for being here. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe if you want to hear more. I have more to say. I think I always did.